Welcome, everybody. I'm David Theo Goldberg, the director of the University of California Humanities Research Institute, and this is UCHRI's forum on the question of civil war. We're looking forward to a powerful discussion among our formidable interlocutors today on this pressing notion of civil war. I want to thank all our staff for making this possible, to the ASL interpreters, Bob Loparo and Arlene Narvaez, who you will see interchangeably from time to time, helping us reach out to a larger audience. And I especially want to thank our interlocutors, Adom Getachew, Achille Mbembe, Elisabeth Anker, and Brad Evans, for so readily agreeing to engage with each other and to engage with us in this conversation. We intend indeed a conversation. So after the brief intros, I will start with some questions to get our discussants exercised, and we will shape a discussion in real time. About 25 minutes or so will be left for the audience to ask questions at the end. We've turned off chat to avoid the kind of virtual civil war Zoom bombing. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom to be able to pose questions, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. So let me begin with the, just by saying we are super fortunate to have four fabulous critical political theorists with us in conversation today, and I'm going to introduce each much too briefly. You can go online to find out much more about them. Adom Getachew is Nobel Family Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She's the author of World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, on the Anti-Colonial Archive and its lessons for us today, a really incredible read, and a marvelous recent long read article in The Nation on the work, and I mean pretty much all the work, of Orlando Patterson. Elisabeth Anker holds professorial positions in American Studies and political science at George Washington University, in the heart of the city where much of the political action has been this past week. And the author of Orgies of Feeling, Melodrama and the Politics of Freedom. She's involved in the editing of more journals than I can even name, including the likes of Theory and Event, and sort of keeps us going, and obviously has read everything because everything comes to those journals, right? Brad Evans holds a chair in political violence and aesthetics at the University of Bath, the United Kingdom. His extensive writing on violence includes most recently the Atrocity Exhibition, Life in an Age of Total Violence, and the forthcoming book next year, Ecce Humanitas, Beholding the Pain of Humanity, that combination of the political and the aesthetic. You should check out his website, Histories of Violence too. I want to say he's played football in the soccer sense for every major league team in America and runs a serious radio show, but I suspect those are his doppelgangers trying to ride his coattails. Achille Mbembe is a research professor at WISER, the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand, and holder of many more positions I'm not going to name here. Each day I open social media, another of Achille's published work has appeared. There's a collection on necropolitics, in French, Politique de l'inimité and Brutalisme, and now freshly out, Achille, Out of the Dark Night from Colombia, including reflection, and his work also recently includes reflections on the right to read and breathlessness of our time. So that's our fabulous panel. And I want to get going just by sort of painting a little canvas about the backdrop, theoretically. A report yesterday indicated that 40% of those in the United States polled about the current political climate, feared civil war no matter the outcome of the coming election in a week. We could ask what they are imagining when they worry about a civil war breaking out. Something like the 1860s, like the Michigan militia this summer storming the legislature, or the streets of Portland? Or is this a more abstract general worry about open carry and trigger happiness confronted by Trumpian characterizations of Antifa? Elsewhere, more conventional understandings of civil war have raged for years, festered and fermented within and beyond borders, proxy clashes of larger geopolitical investments and positionings, mediated projections, and political economies of lack and refusal. So I want to begin by asking, across this landscape, in what ways might it prove analytically generative, if at all, to think through the lens of civil warring in a different vector and register than the conventional one, given the backdrop of the political today, both today and historically? Can or does civil war serve as an analytic for contemporary social conditions? If so, how and to what purpose? And I think I'll start by getting each of the speakers in something like an order to take a stab each at that question, and begin with Adom, and then go to Brad, and then Libby, and then Achille. So Adom, the floor is literally yours.
All right, well, thanks, David, and thanks everybody who's joining us. I think for many of us who live in the United States but come from parts of the world where civil war, political and social disorder have been the dominant or characterizing features of our politics, it's very disorienting to be in a moment where the language of civil war has surfaced or resurfaced in the United States context itself. And I think this is an opportunity perhaps to think about more broadly what the lessons of post-colonial politics, post-colonial democracy are for the wider world and for the North Atlantic context as well. So to think really globally and comparatively about the question of politics and the question of the place of civil war in politics. So in June, when the uprisings began, I was in the middle of a reading group, and we decided to spend some time with two texts on civil war in the Civil War and the aftermath in the US. One is Stephanie McCurry's book, Confederate Reckoning, and the other is Du Bois's classic Black Reconstruction. And I think what was particularly useful about those books is that they don't actually focus on the confrontations, the battlefields of the Civil War, but they try to make us think about what are the political processes that led up to the Civil War. And then of course, Du Bois, most importantly, about the kind of the fallout of the war. So I just wanted to maybe to highlight some things about those books that I think might be productive for our moment. And I think it's particularly what they draw our attention to is the ways in which democratic processes of, especially around electoral politics, end up exacerbating, calcifying, entrenching political identities and political conflicts. So McCurry's book, for instance, focuses largely on she focuses primarily within the Confederate States. And one of the things that's really striking about that book is she makes the case that the Confederacy is really a minoritarian project. Very few Southerners were actually slaveholders. So what's the process by which they generate consensus around the question of secession? And she in particular talks about the ways in which processes of popular mobilization and forms of coercion went hand in hand in producing referendum after referendum, votes for secession. So I think one thing that's really interesting about that is just how the kind of we might think about the internal construction of the groups that end up constituting the two sides of the Civil War. And her point is really that within the Confederacy, there's all these figures who were not obviously part of the Confederate project, but end up being called into it? And what are the mechanisms by which that happens? How does one come to identify on one side of a political battle seems really important. Then to just briefly mention a point from Du Bois that's similarly connected to this question of political mobilization and electoral politics is, I think, that book is obviously telling the story about what he calls the practical reestablishment of slavery after the Civil War. But I think what's really striking is how much attention he pays to the contingency of that political process. So almost 2/3 of that, or 1/3 of the book, is dedicated to a very, very close, fine-grained analysis of the various coalitions at the state level that generate the kinds of outcomes we see, which is the defeat of Reconstruction governments. And there too, I think, in his attention to projects and processes of coalition making, he shows us how race itself, and I think we'll get to this, gets gradually calcified as the basis of a political identity. And it does so in the moment and through the moment of electoral politics. So I think one question we might just ask, again, thinking with these books and thinking about our own moment, is what about elections, the kind of constructions of majorities, the processes of deciding who gets to vote, who counts on the electoral rolls, etc., how those processes generate these forms of escalation, confrontation, etc., that look like civil war. So I'll stop there and come back.
Thanks very much, Adom. Brad, do you want to take off?
Yes, thanks a lot. So I think there's a number of issues, I think, which really raise some important questions for me. I think, first of all, when we're thinking about the idea of civil war, it's a concept. You asked David about, how we should approach the concept analytically. First of all, I would say with a great deal of hesitation. I think civil war as a concept needs to be dealt with a great deal of hesitation because of the consequences of it. And I think in terms of thinking then about, the types of questions, what the analytical concept of civil war would raise, first of all, of course, is, okay, well, where is the battle? Who is the battle between? But perhaps more, difficult to answer is, when is a civil war? And I think this question of the temporalities of civil wars, to me, seems particularly striking. Now, I know we could kind of develop the ideas of Michel Foucault and kind of say, well, okay, civil war is almost like a constant state, which he refers to this as the silent order of battle that's constantly bubbling within any given society. And a point that was picked up by Agamben in his idea of stasis then, that civil war actually is all about the maintenance of a status quo. In other words, it's a violence in the name of civility for the preservation of a certain order. And therefore, civil war can be called upon constantly for the maintenance of order, and it's felt by different constituencies in different ways. And there's actually a brilliant quote for those people who haven't read David Theo Goldberg's piece on this. A quote which I think really captures this is, the slow violence of barely perceptible conflicts, civil wars are social saturations, warring without war, conflictual engagements without full realization. Now, I think the issue which really, I think, troubles me at the moment in particular is that very thin line, perhaps, or the tipping point between when does a slippage occur between a silent battle to actual open warfare. And I think, that is something which we can see happen as a momentum between, we know wars just don't simply happen, they don't fall from the sky. So there is a continued process. But how do we understand the long process of this silent battle, which can very easily, as shown in places like Sarajevo and elsewhere, explode into open warfare very quickly and be politicized in very devastating ways. I think the other thing which the concept of civil war really forces me to think about is both the spatiality and the temporality to civil war. And for instance, to give two basic examples, two people in exactly the same location can have an entirely different affective relationship to that location. So what for one person might feel like a space of peace could be for another person a condition of war. So I think that kind of very subjective spatiality of two people in one place. But I'm also getting to think about, in the age of digitalization, and again, something which David has written about wonderfully on this, is what does it mean perhaps to think of civil war of one person in two different locations as well? The multiple locations through which civil war now occurs between the actual and the virtual. So I think those are the things which I think would really, I guess, really interest me in terms of how do we obviously mobilize against that. Adom just obviously talked about the question of race, and I do want to make perhaps one just further conceptual point before passing over. And this is, again, another point which was made in the article which David wrote about race war as a continuation or revealing many of the hallmarks of religious war. And I actually think, if we want to put this in historical context, seeing race war as a chapter in the history of sacred violence and the ability to sacrifice life for some idea of the greater good allows us to have a much greater understanding perhaps of the history of violence and this continuous motif that humans have to sacrifice life for some idea of greater good, none more so, of course, than make America great again or so forth. Just one final point, which I'd like to just open up as maybe as a provocation. We often perhaps think of civil war as two, and by that I mean two competing entities. But I wonder whether we might see civil war as three, where often there are two sides in a battle played off against one another in a kind of a dialectic, an identity-based dialectic. But behind this, there is the real power, which is manipulating always both disposable sides in a conflict, politicizing both sides, and yet they will become the winners regardless. And I think maybe seeing civil war as three rather than two, but the question, of course, is who is the third? And I think that would be the question we can perhaps open up on discussion as well. So I guess those are my opening thoughts on that. So.
Thanks, Brad. Libby, do you want to weigh in?
Great, thank you. And thanks to everybody who's here. It seems to me what's specific about civil war is also when political opposition, which is the kind of what makes the conflict of politics, but when political opposition becomes the turning of opposition into an existential enemy. And I think in order for that to happen, there has to be ways in which all of the other institutions of politics, protests, forms of direct action are not working to solve fundamental issues about, as David has written about, fundamentally incompatible visions of life, to which I would also add fundamentally incompatible visions of power in terms of who gets access to it, who belongs, what does it look like to share power as a collective, which is what politics is. And I also think, in addition to that, what distinguishes war from civil war is that there has to be some kind of recognition in the past that the groups that are now disintegrating were initially together members of a polity. So there's a sense of a fellowship or brotherhood in an old-fashioned sense that is being torn asunder. And so I think that sense of something that was a collective being undone is really helpful, for me at least, to think about. So we can think about the Civil War in the US in this way, where the Civil War in the US was between white people in the South and white people in the North. And perhaps part of what was happening in terms of the racialized sense of where did Black Americans in the project of abolition fit in was more the war itself, in the sense of making a claim for what a state entails and who gets to be a part of it. And then maybe Reconstruction, and as Adom was already mentioning, the kind of absolute destruction of Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacy might have been the Civil War that was actually more of a kind of largely racially inclusive project, even in its violence. So in this sense, to think about Civil War in those ways, I, as somebody in American studies and thinking about our moment, I think Civil War is actually a quite helpful optic to try to understand what's happening in our present moment. Because I do think we are seeing two quite different versions of understandings of how power is and how it operates and who gets to be part of the collective that are circulating in US life right now. And even though we often have really conflicting and different visions, it does seem to me that we're settling into a kind of oppositional stance. One that I think is quite fascist, if we use that term in order to think about a politics that is about the pleasures of using state power to dominate over other members of a polity, or to think about ways of valuing power where it is homogenous, where it is about purity, where it is about security and a closing of a world and a border, versus what I also see at this moment, which I actually was something I would not have predicted 4 or 5 years ago, but I actually think is both hopeful and is leading somewhat in this kind of really deep existential opposition, which is this deep rise in reinvestment in democratic power. And I don't mean democratic in like the facile way of just like voting or, you know, electoral politics, but a real commitment to forms of equality that are in kind of mutuality across differences, you know, equality in terms of race and gender, and thinking about the uprisings this summer as the largest protests in US history, right? Where people are protesting for Black Lives Matter, protesting against police violence, protesting for abolition, and seeing that that's a kind of multiracial, multi-generational coalition of people all across the United States, right? In every state, over 1,000 different protests. Thinking about the rise of the Democratic Socialist Project, which is also something we can talk about, but a kind of almost intersectional alliance of people who are becoming more invested in politics as the serious sharing of power, and is fighting for that to happen, even when there are still deep conflicts within that space. But I see that as both something that I think is hopeful, but also is leading to this really oppositional moment. You know, right now in Washington, DC, they've been flying airplanes over our airspace for the last week because they're testing the natural levels of radiation in our day-to-day basis, because they are worried that there could be some kind of nuclear attack or dirty bomb that will happen in Washington, DC in the inauguration. And the worry, from what I understand, is not of some kind of nebulous terrorist from abroad, but because of white terrorists from within. And so when we see things like that, and we think about the kinds of violence that are rising to this moment and the potentiality for it, you know, civil war seems to me to be the right way to begin talking about it.
Thank you. Achille, do you want to pick up on some of these themes and run with others, whatever you want, also in a more wider global context, if you want to do that? Achille, you need to unmute yourself.
I very much liked the piece, David, you wrote for Critical Times, the title of which is precisely Civil War. I'm sure that you wrote it knowing very well the extent to which the fact of civil war, or the event of civil war, has been and is still to a large extent a kind of dark shadow of both ancient politics and of contemporary politics. The term itself, it seems to me, is polemical, if you allow me to play with such words. It is polemical in the exact sense witchcraft is polemical in some societies. So I would put forward, first of all, the idea that civil war is like witchcraft. In terms of what it reveals, and in terms of what it forecloses. And if I followed Elisabeth, Brad, and Adom carefully, it seems to me that they were somewhat trying precisely to highlight the multiple ambiguities that the term carries. But since you ask us to say something about the term as a potential analytic, let me just say two or three things briefly. And here I would like to refer to the work of a French historian called Nicole Leroux, who studied the fact of civil war, especially in ancient Greece, where the term had a very specific meaning. In a framework, political imaginative framework, which itself was very much nourished by the myth of autochthony, the idea of a general kinship linking together all citizens. I mention this because it's absolutely central to the idea of civil war. Simply put, civil war is a war in the family. It is a war at home, if you want. And this matters a lot, for political or superpowers which are used to conduct wars abroad. When war comes back home, whether it comes back entirely as it was operating from outside or whether it is engineered from within, then we can talk of a civil war. It's a war at home. It is a cruel tragedy for a number of reasons, starting with the fact that it's a battle that confronts kinsmen and women with their own kinsmen and women. It is a strife that is no longer prevented from the fact of being from the same stock. This concept of the same stock or the same blood, I think it's absolutely crucial for any, let's say, re-enchantment of the term civil war in our times. Let me add, just to add to the ambiguities of the term, that in ancient Greece too, the term refers to a double movement. One, the potential abolition of the political. If we define the political as a mode of sublimation of violence, as opposed to the political as the shedding of blood, ancient Greeks really make that distinction absolutely clear. The political can lead to the shedding of blood, but it's not its primary definition. Its primary definition is precisely to be a modality of negotiating antagonisms with the aim of avoiding bloodshed, especially bloodshed among those of the same stock. But, and I'll end there, civil war in ancient Greece is also the kind of war led by people who know that one day they will be reconciled. So the prospect of reconciliation is always underpinning civil war. If it disappears, it's no longer a civil war. It's a different kind of war. The possibility of reconciliation has to be there for a civil war to be a true, authentic civil war. Short of that prospect of reconciliation, we are dealing with something entirely different.
Thank you all for those provocations. I wonder if we can't sort of see a number of elements, and sort of people should, the panelists should feel free to weigh in, sort of in relation to any of these themes. On the one hand, you know, as Achille has pointed out, the civility in civil war speaks to a certain boundedness, conceptually, a boundedness that perhaps has been lost in the contemporary sort of uptake of the notion. I mean, there's a sense in which very often the reconciliation is predicated on the possibility of an outsider, perhaps a third party that that Brad mentioned, who has both manipulated but also positioned him or themselves in a space of being able to negotiate the mediation sort of between the parties in antagonism with each other. So there's a way in which one slips into, and all of you sort of spoke in ways that speak to this, there's a slipping into and out of civil war. I mean, it's almost, you know, and that question that you raised, sort of, you know, the when of civil war. When does civil war start and when does it end? And does it ever start and ever end? And is the political, in general, some version, I mean, even if reconciliation is at the very center of it, but, you know, perhaps all politics sort of has an element of, you know, not just in, maybe in a Foucauldian way, but not just in a Foucauldian way. You know, all politics has some aspect of civil warring as part of it. But I want to add in the frame of a question, something that was not picked up on, but not in the comments, but drawing on what I'll call Libby's term in her own work. Is there a kind of melodrama to civil warring, right? And if there is a melodrama, you know, how does it operate? Or what is its way of, you know, of becoming fiery and explosive, or indeed of diffusing those kinds of tensions that spark and seemingly inadvertently one is in it before one knows one's in it, and then it's too late, right? I mean, that kind of modality. So the role of the melodramatic, and one sees it in the contemporary polity today. I mean, the bidding up without realizing the implications of what one is bidding up to, right? And then the question is, you know, is there a possibility of pulling back from that once the bidding up has assumed a logic and a fuel of its own, a spark of its own? Right? So, you know, and you know, the racial, of course, plays a role in that melodrama too, right? So one can think of it in those terms as well. Maybe Libby, do you want to begin, given that I've invoked a term you've...
Sure. You know, I actually think, to get to your question about melodrama, the melodrama of civil warring, I think, is a really accurate phrase. And one way we can even think about it is warring melodramas, right? So, you know, if part of the work of melodrama in a political sense is to turn political conflict into moralized and existential conflicts of good and evil, right? To turn right and wrong or serious political antagonisms, but to turn that into a moralizing space of good and evil, where the only way to solve the problem is the extermination of villainy or the deep punishment of villainy, then it seems to me thinking about it in that way is really helpful. But of course, part of the problem is that those visions are irreconcilable oftentimes, because the hero of one melodrama and the victim of one melodrama is the villain in another, right? So if we do think of the present moment, and I think it is helpful to think just within a US context, right? We have the melodrama on one side where Trump is certainly the kind of figuration of evil, though he's also just catalyzes, or at least maybe congeals, a whole host of problems that, as my colleague Kenan Ferguson said, were always part of the American space. He just says, you know, he shouts the things that are often said sotto voce, right? But the kinds of white nationalism, the deep heteropatriarchy, the misogyny, the kind of, you know, class antagonisms to a certain degree. And yet on the other side, right, for people who are catalyzed by Trump and see him as both the hero and as the victim of politics, which he's often playing, right? The enemy is kind of immigrants, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, feminists, right? And you know, to get a melodrama where people would actually be able to reconcile or have some kind of redemption or to solve a problem becomes really difficult in that space, because melodrama often doesn't really allow for that kind of, for that merging of narratives, we could say. So I think the ramping up is the easier part, and the diminishing, the moving away from melodrama is harder. Thanks.
Thank you. Others? Does anybody? Yeah, Brad.
Yeah, I want to pick up, and I guess it's something which I know Libby's also mentioned before about what I think is also at stake here is incompatible different ideas of freedom and the way in which these are competing. And I want to connect this maybe to Achille's point on the witchcraft. And as Achille was speaking, I couldn't help thinking of the work of Walter Benjamin and the importance of the mythical and how the mythical plays this key role in the melodrama, and the idea of creating this mythical idea of a society which can be inclusive but also, you know, exclusive as well. And you can incorporate people in order to banish them, you can incorporate people in order to punish them, and that kind of, you know. And I think that the brilliant phrase that Achille used, that it's a cruel tragedy, that is something of a real cruelty to you. But I guess the other question, which really troubles me by this then, is that if we talk about reconciliation, and it's a point which you raised, David, if we think about the reconciliation process, and I would agree with Achille's reading on this, of a civil war to happen, there has to be that kinship and that idea of reconciliation. But the question then becomes, you know, reconciliation on whose terms, or whose truth of the reconciliation do we follow through? If we see that a civil war is taking place and a civil war is a battle for the organization of power, whose truth are we going to impose on that reconciliation? We know throughout history there's been truth and reconciliations, and often the victims maintain themselves in the position of the victim. It's just, you know, everything changes, so everything remains the same. And therefore, I think this is one of the real difficult challenges we face today in terms of contemporary politics, where on the one hand, it can sometimes feel like the change is happening. I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it can sometimes feel like change is happening, but yet power is already 2 steps ahead sometimes, and it can just re-articulate the order of the reconciliation to make its own truth happen before us, and we can accept the new mythical arrangements. And I think that's why, for me, in this moment, not only is it important to be vigilant, but it's also important to be very clear about the dangers of some of the narratives which are certainly being peddled by Trump at the moment, because it's at a particular moment in history where things could go terrifyingly wrong very quickly. And I think that perhaps is the warning of this mythical politics.
Adom, yeah.
I wonder if, I mean, thinking about the question of de-escalation, it might be worth trying to reconstruct how we got to the moment of escalation, or how we got to the moment of these highly political conflicts framed as existential conflicts. And, you know, again, I think I find myself very struck by the kind of everyday ways that some forms of antagonism happen. So for instance, we're in the middle of a whole crisis about voter rolls, right? Who's on the voter rolls, when people get to, who gets to vote in the election, how they get to vote in the election. And again, I think thinking about that question in comparative, both historical and global terms, that seems to be just a central feature of democratic competition, right? And electoral politics. So in a very different context, in neighborhoods in Accra, right? There's similar kinds of conflicts that are predicated on who's indigenous to a particular kind of community, right? And that determines who ought to show up on the voter rolls for this particular district. And there's a great book on urban Ghanaian politics by Jeffrey Peller, who talks about the different configurations of this at the very neighborhood level. So I think for me, one question is, how do those kind of very routine political processes engender forms of antagonism, forms of politicized identity in particular kinds of ways that may escalate up to something like civil war, or may not, right? Because they're also just very routine features of electoral politics. And I think in some ways, I think that's also what Du Bois is doing in Black Reconstruction, right? Instead of telling us a story in which the conflicts were always already existential ones, he's trying to show us the kind of mechanisms by which they come to be that by the end of Reconstruction. And I think the way out seems to be to think more about the way we got into it.
Achille, do you want to add anything? Oops. Achille?
What is your question?
Oh, I mean, do you want to add anything to the exchange that is taking place over here? Do you want to contribute to the question around whether it's melodrama, whether it's the tensions at the level of the local in different contextual framings? Do you have anything to?
Yes, no, I think it. I mean, unless my English is not very, I'm not sure. I'm not responsible for what I say in English. I think it's a bit more than a melodrama. I think it's really a serious matter. That's why with Brad, we were referring to the idea of tragedy. But if you allow me to go back to the origins of the term, at least in political theory in ancient Greece, the thing is that however we define a civil war, the fact is that it leads at the end to the spilling of the blood of one's race. That is its scandalous nature. And the supposition is that if you spill the blood of another's race, this is not that scandalous. And I think that in the world we live in as we speak, this is still the case. This was the case, Adom, when you refer to Du Bois' argument on all of this. It was the case under slavery. It was, of course, the case under colonialism. And in fact, one can define modern colonialism as one way in which European powers did outsource the threat of civil war that was they were going through. They outsourced it outside. Aimé Césaire and the others then making the case that you cannot outsource civil war outside without it at some point coming back to haunt you right at home. So that is not a melodrama. It is a real tragedy. Now, the tragedy is still continuing. When the war at home is not necessarily a war between those of the same stock. When home is in fact made of fundamentally people who are of multiple stocks, and people who belong to the same political body community, but are not necessarily related between them by ties of kinship, except fictitious ties of kinship, which of course define what citizenship is all about. So that's one point. The other point, David, is that we live in a moment when neoliberalism, however we want to define it, has in fact declared a war on the state, war of its own. And that's what it's all about, really. The task of the government being to fight against itself. I mean that under neoliberal stricture, the role of the state is to fight itself in order for it to dépérir, to perish, if you want. But if we look at part of what is going on in, probably in the US partly, but elsewhere also. I mean, the state is fighting a war against its own people. We could reread in an entirely different way today Foucault's term, society must be defended. Why must it must be defended, or it must defend itself, which is not exactly the same thing. When we say society must defend itself, and when we say society must be defended by whom, it must defend itself how and why? Precisely because it is under siege by or embroiled in a war in which the state is an active force. But above all of that, I will end there. It seems to me that part of what really characterizes the now, whether in the US or in other parts of the world, is the kind of metaphysics of our times, metaphysics which give a prominent place to the idea of an imminent apocalyptic danger. The feeling being that we are on the brink of annihilation, that feeling is part of the affect of the times. So what we are seeing is a kind of political theology, which, for instance, holds that white people are the true lost tribe of Israel, and that people of color, Jewish people, are descended from Satan, but that white people are in charge of clearing the world of non-white people before the return of Christ. This is not at all a marginal belief or a small myth, to use Brad's term. It's one of the big myths of our times. And it seems to me that that's the direction we have to go if we want to make sense of, let's say, the myriad forms civil war is taking, whether in the US or in other parts of the world today.
You raise a really interesting question about neoliberalism in the way you've sort of formulated it. It's an attack not so much on the state as such, even though it often formulates itself as such, but an attack on a certain form of the state, on the state as the site of the commons, of the kind of general commitment to the well-being of all, and so on and so forth, right? And in doing so, the implication of your insight seems to be that civil war is an outcome of the declaration of neoliberalization, not just within a particular state, but as a global project. I mean, there's a sense in which what one can, and this is an open question to everybody, you know, insofar as neoliberalization sees itself succeeding, it sees the necessity of its success as a kind of international revolution, right? As the transformation of everywhere in the name of the project that comes from particular sites. So there's a kind of colonizing reach as well, you could say. And so the set of questions, perhaps we can pose this as a set of questions before we open up to others, to those listening in. The set of questions is, is whether we think of the moment we're in, in an obvious way as the inheritance of the, certainly the post-1970s neoliberalization that definitely is a global project, and how, in thinking of it in those terms, it takes on the kind of racial configurations, the extension of the racial configurations of earlier moments, perhaps as a kind of resistance to the logics that came out of the anti-colonial and post-colonial movements on the one hand, and assumes a certain sort of gendered configurations alongside of it. So sort of to complexify the moment of the the contemporary revolution, the effect of which we've inherited from the last 30 or 40 years, right? Others who want to sort of enter into the space of, Brad.
Yeah, David, I think the way you just presented that is really important in terms of understanding the broad sweep of neoliberal history, because then we have an understanding that, Trump didn't just fall from the skies, right? Actually, and I think actually Donald Trump is an accelerationist. He really accelerates a lot of existing dynamics which are already in play for many, many years. Now, the point which I really like, which Achille made, and really connects, I think, to Adom's point about the everyday antagonisms actually, is this idea of, the war on the state. Can we even use the term society anymore, right? Foucault talks about society must be defended. In the UK, we had Margaret Thatcher, right, who says there's no such thing as society, right? And I'm wondering to what extent actually, as a dominant motif for power, has society actually been replaced by the home? Because the home itself becomes, I know there's a beautiful poem by Warsan Shire who talks about the meaning of home, but home itself now becomes almost like this site of intimate politics, that we can only trust the atomization of the home. In the United States, the big fight over the homeland. What does the homeland really mean? To expel people who don't belong to the home. And I think that intimacy of politics, of course, we know through Wilhelm Reich, that's where fascism really thrives, in this micro physics of power, in this idea of the homeliness. And then, your point then, David, about then, well, where does this leave us in terms of the contemporary reach of colonization? Well, in this age, in the pandemic, it's where we all are sat now. It's at home. So the colonial is reaching into the house. The fascism is reaching into the house. And because the home perhaps has displaced the society as a way of rethinking the order of power. And that's where then Adom's point about the everyday antagonisms becomes so crucial as an analytic for this power, especially the digital antagonisms as well in the age of this neoliberal accelerationism. And I think that's perhaps the point to remember with COVID as well. While some things have really slowed down to a standstill, other measures of power have been accelerating beyond all conceivable measure. And to make sense of that, I think, is also important as part of this Civil War narrative.
Libby.
Great. Thanks. I'm also glad that we brought up neoliberalism. And I think both of Achille's points, on the one hand, that neoliberalism is a war on the state, though, as I think David also said, right, also a war on the public, or what is a public and who gets to even be in it? Is it a value? As well as the kind of the global movement of white people in charge of cleaning the world. And I wonder if we can see this movement, the kind of deep rise of white ethno-nationalisms around the globe as in part a response to neoliberal attempts to reshape, eviscerate aspects of a state, and certainly to eviscerate a public. Because it seems to me there's a sense in which, right, part of the work of neoliberalism is the way in which people, the kind of loss of political participation, or loss of even venues for a political, loss of a political that is even, worth striving for, or worth having. And I think there's a way in which this rise of ethno-nationalism is actually pushing back against that in particular ways, right? It's a reclamation of state power, or of a claim that that kind of white nationalists are able to organize and control state power, in particular and in violent ways. So it's right? A reclamation even of a public in a particular way. When we think of things like Trump rallies, right? Or marching of skinheads, across Europe right now, right? That is a reclamation of public space in an incredibly violent and exclusionary way. So I think there's a way in which some of this movement is actually a response to neoliberalism. And maybe if we go back to Brad's point about there being a third term, maybe neoliberalism here is part of that third term of civil war. When we think of where the benefits accruing globally, who is going to remain unscathed if there's bloodshed on the streets, right? Who is siphoning money and in fact privatizing off of forms of bloodshed that we see, incipient forms right now. So just a few thoughts on that.
Adom?
I guess I would just, add or extend Libby's point. And I think the demographic imaginary or imagination of this moment is really striking. I mean, the constant fixation on numbers, right? And the declining numbers possibly, or declining majorities of white majorities in the US, and more generally, just there's a kind of fixation on the demographic that I think seems really important, and again seems very driven around or connected to the kinds of mobilizations I was describing on a lower scale. I think, again, I'm sorry to keep returning to the Du Bois, but I think there's a way that those mobilizations in our contemporary moment of the demographic want us to imagine and want to make demography translate into politics, right? To make that transition seamless. But again, I think going back to that moment of the 19th century Civil War and its afterlives in the US, we see all these ways in which actually that was a really open question about whether demographic politics would map onto actual political positions. And I think, this goes back in some ways to Brad's third vector possibly is, the point that Stephanie McCurry makes about the Confederacy is that Confederate leaders never imagine or think about all the people on their side who might not actually be on their side, or who might be ambivalent vis-a-vis their side, right? They never think about what slaves are going to do once the war starts. And this becomes, of course, very important in how the war plays out. And they never think about women and women's politicization during the war, and the ways in which women would become a profound internal challenge to the Confederacy. So there's this kind of conception or imagination of building a unitary popular will by the Confederacy, or in the contemporary moment by a white supremacist or white nationalists. And the internal frictures and fractures of that, I think, are important to think with, and to not buy their ideological story that in fact a unitary popular will has been constituted.
Okay, can I just push you for a moment, sort of on a broadening of the demographic question. In contrast with the 19th century Civil War, demography today has both a more mobile sort of reach. Populations are moving more readily as a result of globalization and all the forces that we know were attendant to it. Coming again out of the 50s and 60s and the response to it and so on. And the kind of anti-immigration politics that started really, they were always kind of riffing there, but in the 1980s began to be ramped up, not just in the United States, but in Europe, no less, right? And has taken on a dynamic in almost every place that you can point to in a sense, so that the way in which the demographic sort of factors into the sense to both the fear of reconfiguration as a result of this mobility, and into an actual reconfiguration, again, as a kind of response to the mobility, right? Sort of get set in place. And there's an element of if not civil war in a conventional sense, a kind of warring, antagonistic set of politics that emerge out of that set of configurations, almost as a mark of our moment, right?
Yeah. Well, this just reminds me of that, the book from maybe last year, The Scramble for Europe, which is a whole story about huge, growth of populations in Africa, a young population scrambling for Europe. And of course, it's a reference back to the Scramble for Africa, but one that even though the author says this isn't his intention, very much frames it as a kind of impending race war. So I think that's, it's absolutely right that I don't mean to draw the the analogy to the 19th century so closely, but yeah.
Achille, were you about to say something, or?
No, I was just agreeing with Adom. The author of the book is Stephen Smith.
So we're going to move to some questions from our audience, still with us. I'm going to start with a question that comes out of Achille's initial reflection on reconciliation, but the question is posed to all, and it's slightly long. It seems to me mistaken, says the questioner, to say that a civil war requires an anticipation of reconciliation, and that this anticipation of reconciliation differentiates civil war from war. Yes, there's a view that politics is war by other means, in which case even war anticipates reconciliation, including even the extermination of one's enemies. Note the cynicism in this view. If we mark in advance that a civil war already anticipates reconciliation, we then risk underestimating violence and overestimating our ability to control or contain it. War cannot know its end in advance. So some of you have reflected on the openness of that set of questions. Maneuvers, maybe, but war, no. Violence can't know where it stops. Isn't this what Antigone teaches us? That kinship tragically and perhaps melodramatically is no barrier. In this sense, we can only name a civil war as such when it is over. And so back to one of the mysteries, when is a civil war and when does it end? So Achille, do you want to sort of start with some reflection on that, and then others can jump in?
Look, I take all of that on board, of course. I was speaking, as I said, drawing from the work of Nicole Leroux, whose views on the concept of the two concepts of stasis and polemos in ancient Greece are quite authoritative, to the point where political theories of the Civil War since her work have felt obliged to contend with what she says. Case, for instance, of the lectures by Agamben published under the title Stasis a few years ago. The fact, historical fact, is that in ancient Greece, civil war is, among other things, the kind of war which is led by people who are not only related among themselves by ties of blood, but who are not only of the same stock, and I use that term deliberately, but these are also people who know that one day they will be reconciled, that hatred will change into reconciliation. In that sense, a civil war is a war at the end of which a festival of reconciliation is possible. Doesn't mean that it will always happen, but that possibility is fundamentally inscribed in the strictures of a civil war. So why is it that I was referring to this? Because I wanted to bring us to think about the qualities of those wars which are led against those who are not of the same stock, but who nevertheless happen to inhabit the same, if you want, body political community. I think, for instance, of African Americans in America. But beyond that, David, it seems to me, one of the many key issues you are inviting us to think about has to do, for instance, how do we share the earth if we are not defined by a common birth, or if we don't belong to the same stock, a stock in the sense of, whatever, race, but stock also in the economic sense, the capitalist economic financial sense. So I insist on this concept of a stock. How do we share the earth if indeed we're not defined by, it seems to me that is part of what explains a lot of the accelerationist politics we see today, white supremacy being one of them.
Yeah, I do wonder, and this is to sort of sense a little bit of tension between Achille and Brad, given Brad's early sort of reflection, his opening reflection on the way in which whatever, he didn't call it reconciliation because he only used the term afterwards, Achille, but in the logics of reconciliation, in the politics of reconciliation, the kind of repositioning of the dispositioned, right? In their dispositioned space again and again and again, right? So that even while there's a reconciliation, there's an extended disinheritance or an extended disavowal of their position, at least in part, which continues the conditions of resentment and resentment that get extended and assume a new kind of politics, but still a politics that carries some of the resentment along with it. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Brad, but
no, but I recognize that. And
there's something of a tension at TRC,
it's a very
right?
important point Brad raised. Maybe I'm speaking too much from the South African experience, which is, reconciliation, yes. But we know very well that it has many limits. But what is interesting in that possibility is that irreconcilability is dealt with, let's say, the very possibility of reparation acts as a horizon of openness, which does not preclude, antagonisms and fights and struggles, but at least the belief that things are open, that they can be negotiated, that the political is a matter of constant, permanent negotiation, in which nothing is ever won once for all. Everything can always be the object of a revision, but under conditions short of a generalized spilling of blood. I think that's something we have to look into.
Brad, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think Achille's more optimistic slant is far better story to go with, I think, on this occasion. I think I guess I'm struggling with, I guess, this, I want to think about this in the context of then the relationship in civil war between the self and the other, and the way Achille maps it out. And I think if we understand civil war, particularly through, the early important Greek model, which Achille points out, and then civil war in the context of colonization and the civil war through that paradigm, there was still a necessity for the other, whether the other was to be exploited productively, and that continued need for the necessity for the other. And even if we think of the, some of the most brutal, terrifying civil wars through Latin America in the 60s, 70s, 1980s, there was never the outright obliteration of the other. There was always the need for the other in one way or another, right? So, and I think perhaps, what we're talking about, what is as Achille was speaking, I guess I was thinking about, well, what's the alternative word for reconciliation? Well, it's obliteration, or perhaps it's annihilation. Maybe we can talk about the full annihilation of the other. Now, perhaps one of the most difficult questions I think we all perhaps face right now, and certainly Elisabeth and Adom will be better placed to answer this in the context of the United States, and certainly you as well, David, is to what extent does society any longer need the other? Right? Do we need the other anymore in this context? And I think what perhaps surprises us all, particularly in this age of new media technologies, is we're encountering problems we all thought had been resigned to the historical dustbin, but they're back again. And actually, this idea that the more we know about the world, the less violent we become, just simply doesn't match the reality in which we're living in. And actually, it seems to be all the more possible to kill people violently with all the video cameras in the world upon them. And I think, in this age of mass surveillance, for bodies to disappear in the thousands and tens of thousands. So I think this is the contradiction of our times. And actually, maybe perhaps what makes this moment perhaps even more pessimistic for me is actually maybe we no longer need the other in that context of civil war, such that the types of reconciliation, which I really hope Achille is right on this, that there is a possibility of the open of politics. But perhaps when I look at the political landscape today, I'm struggling to find where those openings are. Where it is the openness, because it seems the politics is becoming so entrenched, it looks more theological than anything else. And I think that's, but I would rather, stick with Achille's optimism on this and maybe not be so pessimistic.
I'm going to, there's not all that much time left. And although there are lots of questions we won't get to, sorry, everybody. We'll provide them to the panelists, and if they feel they want to follow up after the fact, they can. But I want to end with two questions that extends this tension that is not just a tension between Brad and Achille, but a tension in the very conditions of possibility of the political. And the one is whether climate change and maybe digitality as well sort of factor into the kind of pessimism that we're seeing prolific, not just in the landscape in certain registers in the US, but a kind of, what Achille in other work is called liberal pessimism, a kind of pessimism that pervades that climate change kind of extends and ramifies in a certain way as a kind of apocalyptic event, also playing into neoliberalism as a third term. That's the language of Catherine Andrews asking that question. And then Wendy Brown, and maybe this will carry us through, although if it doesn't, pose a couple of other questions. Wendy asked, and this is the sort of flip side of that, the kind of, whether there's a closing down in the wake of all this pessimism of a kind of aspirational futurity. So I'll read Wendy's question out loud. Does the recognition of past commonality or eventual reconciliation that Elisabeth and Achille identify as Civil War's defining characteristics perhaps give way in an era of A, endless wars, and B, nihilism that detaches participants from identification with the past of investment in a future? Right. So the question of futurity of what I've elsewhere called futureless futures sort of becomes, I think, quite pressing. Right? So maybe Libby, we can start with you and Adom, and if there's time, we'll go to Achille and Brad. Libby?
I'd be happy to think about that. I mean, especially what is a future? Is there a future? And there's so much important work about the ways in which vibrant visions for futures have been shut down, whether those are about, decolonized futures in the wake of the end of colonialism, whether it's the kind of end of a kind of American dream in a liberal democratic space, or even the end of a really vibrant left at a global way. And it's that last one that I actually feel might be shifting, that maybe there is a way in which people are moving past, what Lauren Berlant has called the kind of impasses of the present, where dreams for the past no longer seem to provide visions for the future, but we're not yet sure where they go. And there does seem to me, I'm not normally the person who's in the position of feeling optimistic about the world, but in the visions that we're seeing of a future, especially with younger people, especially when I think of the millions and millions of people who are out on the streets these days for multitude of different causes that are actually pushing them more left than they might have been before they walked onto that street, quite literally. And there seems to me to be a huge anger and a pushback against neoliberalism, against white supremacy, against the kind of just rampant misogyny that structures our world. And actually not just against things, but kind of incipient recognitions that there are things to be for. And whether or not it's a necessarily galvanizing, clear vision of the future, I think there are ways in which people are beginning to articulate what does a world look like when people actually have equal power, and that people are putting their bodies on the line and in the streets, and where we will, who knows, starting to think about those visions. So I actually think we might be past a kind of, not past, but maybe I should say there are moments of visions for a future that are not wholly about the apocalyptic climate. When I think about someone like Naomi Klein and even the enormous movement of the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal, where people realize that in order to actually fight for climate futures, we don't need to invent things and we don't need to make newness. We literally just have to have the political will to decarbonize and to, and change our, electrical, processes and things like that. And I feel like we're seeing an incipient moment where this political will is starting to happen at a translocal and a transnational way. So, whether or not that springs civil war against people who are arguing very distinctly against those visions is another question. But I'm seeing visions of a future that is kind of on the cusp of being limned more clearly.
Yeah, do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I guess I want to kind of think with the South Africa example a little more. And I think what's really instructive about the South Africa example is that the moment of reconciliation isn't restored. It's not a restorative vision. It's not a return to a prior moment of unity or something like that. It's the generation of a new conception of oneself as a citizen of South Africa. And it's also, of course, a partial one, at the time felt necessarily partial one that tried to think about the political dimensions, and certainly, of course, now has left open the question of the social and economic dimensions of what that reconciliation will look like. So for me, that is, I think, a really important example to think with, because again, it's not one that imagines that what we're doing is in the process of recovering something, but generating something new. And the questions for me, that is what kinds of, I mean, what forms of political movement made it possible for that moment of, even if it's a partial moment of reconciliation to happen. And the kind of broad-based social movement, organization, anti-apartheid movement that made that possible, I think is a really important lesson for our own moment. And I want to tie this to a question that we might not get to, but Nasser Mufti asked about the question of civil war had once been the thing that we associate with the periphery, with the post-colonial world, with not here, right, but elsewheres. And what do we make of the arrival of the concept into the contemporary US space? And I think I guess what I would say about that is, I think this should be an occasion for us to rethink what we thought were the sources of civil war. So as coming out of the field of political science, which pioneered studying civil wars all over the world, I think so many of those studies always want to situate the sources in things like nationalism, ethnic identity, and I think this moment and the ways in which civil war has appeared in our own context might lead us to think that about more general or generalizable dimensions of modern politics that produce these forms of enmity. So I think that's, for me, why I've talked a lot about democratic politics in this event, and electoral politics in particular, as one way of thinking about processes that are shared actually across different spaces, across the post-colonial world and the North Atlantic. And that also, again, thinking from my field as a political theorist, that this might be a way also to kind of have a denormativized or non-idealized way of thinking about democratic politics, thinking really about its internal contradictions and limits, as well as the ways it gets captured by external forces. So, and I think the South Africa example, and thinking just generally with post-colonial examples of the same kinds of dynamics and the ways potentially they offer different kinds of resources for resolving them, might be, again, a way of thinking about models beyond the ones that appear to us in the United States.
Great, thanks so much. Brad, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess a couple of points just in terms of the first question about the normalized or the ecological. I think one thing that's become very clear to us, particularly the last decade, is that we're becoming acutely aware of the ecologies of suffering which we're kind of all being immersed in. And perhaps the one thing which Trump has made so apparent actually is the importance of atmosphere to our understanding of politics, and particularly the atmosphere of violence. So understanding those ecologies and those ecological terms and taking them much more seriously. I think Wendy Brown's question is really important. Obviously not the time to answer it, but I think and certainly perhaps the opportunity for another conversation on what does nihilism look like today? How do we conceptualize nihilism? How do we think of nihilism in this contemporary moment? And I'd maybe just end on a point which came through in a conversation I recently had with James Martell, when James talks about fascism and the very real presence of fascism in the world today, and whether we can talk about American fascism. But certainly James is, and if there's anything to be optimistic from what I take from James's reading, where he says that fascism is inherently vulnerable. So we often think of fascism as defined by its strength, but fascism is actually defined by its vulnerability. And maybe to have a better understanding of nihilism as a form of vulnerability allows us perhaps to have a better grasp and a better optimism for the future, if there's some to be added. So.
Thank you. Interesting. Achille.
I think the ecological question, we didn't go there as much as we should have, but it's absolutely crucial. When yesterday we were preoccupied mostly with the questions of how life emerges, more and more many are preoccupied with the question of how it ends and under what conditions. So this question of futures of life and the futures of the earth, I think, are crucial to a new understanding of both war and the natures of civil strife in general. But I would like to just make a few brief comments on Wendy's question, because it is a very important one. I mean, we tend to forget that the so-called triumph of liberal democracy was underwritten to a large extent by highly destructive technologies. I would argue that the same highly destructive technologies are fast, to use Wendy's term, hollowing this same liberal democracy out. Such technologies basically threaten, at least from my point of view, the possibility of any human continuity at all. And when they are coupled with financial or digital capitalism, what they do is that they erect uncertainty into the ultimate resource, as well as the ultimate existential risk or threat. So far, so that we are reduced nowadays to calculating probabilities. The anticipation of possible futures, of course, has become an intrinsic part of the management of time, but time understood as basically randomness, randomness itself understood as a mode of order, broader cultural preoccupation being with chance and contingency. So it seems to me that with this way of manipulation of time, the future is drawn into the present instead of the present being projected into the future. And this, I think, is at the heart of deeper metaphysical tendencies of our times, of which she referred to as including forms of nihilism. But we could find another term for that. I think survivalism and separatism characterize a lot of what is going on, since that we hardly believe nowadays that we need the other. The question is, what do we do with those we do not need, we think we do not need, who do not count? How do we rule them? What do we do with them? Where do we, what portion of the earth is it that we'll assign to them? Or do we need to get rid of them? How will we do that? With what forms of justification?
Thank you. On this closing set of notes, this has been a really, I think everybody will agree. I want to thank everybody for staying with us. This has been a really insightful and provoking, searching set of reflections on the politics of our time in relation to the historical, but especially focused on the politics of our moment. As we've concluded, we will be posting this with a set of resources to our UCHRI events page. We very much appreciate all the contributions, both the questions from the audience and especially to Adom Getachew, Elisabeth Anker, Brad Evans, and Achille Mbembe for a really memorable conversation. Thanks so very much. Been terrific. And we'll see you all soon. Stay well, everybody. Thank you. And safe.